Well, good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. I'm sure we'll have a few more people joining us as we proceed today. As we get started, I'd just like to introduce DAIR's Executive Director, Maurice Harvey, to say a few words of welcome. Maurice?
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I just want to say a warm welcome to everybody who's joining online, but also to the folks who are with us here at Centennial College for DAIR's second AGM. So welcome to everyone. We're delighted to have you. Also, a warm welcome to Grant McDonald, and thank you very much, Grant, for doing this. And I will pass it over right now to Phil Arthurs, Director of Operations, but also our MC for today. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you very much, Maurice, and it is my pleasure to be the MC and welcome all of you here today for our webinar. As Maurice said, my name is Phil Arthurs. I'm the Director of Operations for Downsview Aerospace Innovation and Research, or DAIR. And for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are an incorporated not-for-profit consortium consisting of industry and academic members whose vision is to be a world-leading aerospace innovation hub. We currently operate out of member facilities on site at Downsview Park in Toronto and are working on growing the physical hub. And at the same time, we are working to drive collaboration and innovation in R&D, supply chain advancement, and training. And we aim to bring the aerospace community together in forums such as this, whether they be online, in person, or hybrid. And today we're excited to welcome Grant McDonald, Global Head of Aerospace and Defense for KPMG, to share insights on mergers and acquisitions in the sector and the implications on small and medium-sized enterprises. And just before I turn it over to Grant, I also wanted to encourage all of you to visit the events page of dairhub.com to see our upcoming events. And I specifically want to highlight a free online webinar that we're hosting next Tuesday at 1 p.m. together with the National Research Council of Canada, where we're going to be discussing Canada's role in sustainable and green research and development. So please do sign up for that and share with your colleagues. For today, we're going to be keeping all participants' microphones muted throughout our session, and we will have an opportunity for Q&A after Grant's presentation, but I would ask that you use the Q&A function, which should be at the top bar of your Teams application, to type in and submit your questions. And after Grant finishes, we'll be posing those questions to him. And then we can have that dialogue at that point. I'd also like to simply mention that we'll be recording today's session, and so it will be available for participants afterwards. So with that, I'll thank you again and turn it over to Grant to walk us through his presentation today. Grant?
Thank you, Phil. And can you hear me, Phil?
I can indeed.
Wonderful. Then what I'll do is I'll put my deck up, and if you can just let me know when you're seeing that, then we'll be now it's spinning. It wasn't spinning when we did the test run, so let's see here. You should be seeing it momentarily. There, is it up now?
It is, yes.
Okay, I'll just put it into slideshow mode, so I won't be able to see anyone, but you'll be able to see the screen better, and I'll just minimize you there in my corner. So that's great. Thank you, Phil and Maurice, and I wanted to thank Samantha as well, because it's really been a pleasure working with the DAIR group, and congratulations on what you do for the sector, because I think it's very important that you bring not only industry but also government and academia together for this important industry. As Phil mentioned, my name is Grant McDonald. I am the Global Head of Aerospace and Defense, although for KPMG, although I had been the Canadian leader at one point as well. We've transitioned that role, and now I'm focused really on the global aspects of aerospace and defense for KPMG. But as a Canadian, which is nice. And I know today we have a large group of attendees that really are fully up the supply chain. So right from the OEMs and tier 1, 2, 3, so as well as academics and people from government. So looking forward to sharing my remarks with you. If I can move to the next slide. I only have a couple of slides actually, and the final one really just gives you the links to the various publications, including this most recent thought leadership piece that I'll be focused on today. And we really launched this at Farnborough. What we try to do with our in-depth pieces is really tie them into an upcoming event, and that was the event in July that we launched this particular document at. So with that background, I wanted to say as a starting point, this was actually the second year that we did this particular report. In year one, so in 2021, we thought it was particularly important to address what was happening in the sector, and in particular what we were seeing in M&A, primarily because of, well, three major issues that occurred that we're certainly all familiar with. One was the geopolitical landscape. The second, of course, was the pandemic itself, and really as a result of both of those, we included digital transformation, because whether it's in our own organizations or what we're seeing more broadly in the industry, I think we'd all admit that we had to move to digital pretty quickly. That also did impact on obviously the industrial base that we see in our sector in terms of how the various companies and supply chain members were operating. So that was what we did in 2021, and we took a slightly different approach in 22 that I'll come back to in a moment. But in 21, we worked from a credibility point of view. We wanted to really include geopolitical issues, and again in 22 we did this, and we worked with the Eurasia group that some of you may be familiar with, that really focus on those issues. In 21 as well, we did more of a multi-country scan, so 6 or 8 key countries around the world that we focused on, and frankly in 22, while we still wanted to look at the events and the trends that were shaping deals in aerospace and defense, the real switch there for us in the most recent report was to include many more industry executives. So we wanted to hear the voice of the company, if you will. Now, we interviewed quite a number, and they weren't all included in the report, but I think in terms of this discussion today, getting some of the thoughts and things that we did from a variety of senior executives who were, in the deal space, so in corporate development, in M&A, in finance, and so on. That really added an element to the report, in addition to our, just our subject matter experts, if you will, which again included Eurasia Group. We also added an economist, and then of course our own global team. So we really do an in-depth review when these are occurring. We tend to spend less time, although there's a couple of charts and tables. We do much more frequent charts and tables on deals and valuations and multiples and those sorts of things quite frequently, but we're really looking for more of a high-level discussion in putting out these 16 or 20 or 24 page papers. But we did again start with geopolitics and the macro trends, and clearly what had happened since the last one was the war in Ukraine, and obviously that really did drive a lot of immediate change when it came to certainly the large OEMs, particularly in the US on the defense side, but elsewhere around the world, and getting the assistance that government wished to provide to the Ukraine in terms of platforms and kit and training and so on. It really led to a surge in what was being provided to them. But of course, that led to issues as well around supply chain, of course, which obviously is an issue. And of course, with Russia, and the issues of immediate sanctions, that created supply chain issues as well, particularly when you're looking at some of the products like titanium. So pros and cons in terms of what happened on the defense side, on the geopolitical side, but it really did lead to particularly the allied nations, the NATO, the Western countries, working better together. And I think that that was an important thing, because we are from that. If you look at Germany, for example, and the fact they were pumping another 100 million euros right away into their defense spend, and I think the pressure that occurred on many countries, including Canada, in terms of our increased NATO commitment and that 2% of GDP was something that certainly became a discussion topic. But as I say, it did create challenges on the supply chain side. One of the things we also noticed on the geopolitical side was the transaction oversight. So this is really an M&A point, if you will, once we get through kind of the higher level issues. National security, is paramount, obviously, and the need for that. And as a result, of that stated objective, although I think there's other objectives that really pop in there as well. What we were seeing, and certainly in the US, UK, Australia, Canada, of course, we have the Invest Canada Act as well, so it allows the Canadian government to do this. But we were seeing, much more oversight of the large deals, I would say, not as much on the smaller side. But if you look, for example, at the Lockheed Martin Aerojet Rocketdyne deal, it died. It was a $4 billion deal, as I recall. And the government in the U.S. In that case was concerned about that combination and what it would mean in terms of competition and so on. So we're seeing much more of that, certainly during the pandemic, and then as a result of the war as well. There were additional regulations, laws, and regulations brought in different countries around the world to kind of have more of I'll say, an oversight, a hand, and whether deals could in fact proceed or not. So that was an important element. On the civil side, of course, very clear to all of us, both at the manufacturing level and the supply chain, but also within the airlines, the airports, really the entire, ecosystem of air travel, if you will. Significant challenges that really did continue into 2022, and I think we'll see them beyond that. Whether it was on the the order side itself, and challenges with production rates, and trying to get productions up again. The challenges in what was the popular craft that people were looking for, the single versus double aisle type issues, and certainly on the ecosystem side. Whether it's the airlines or the airports, the whole workforce element, obviously a huge challenge with respect to, a quick volume of, I'll say, more individual and business travel increasing, but the challenges that the entire ecosystem faced, including, in Canada at various airports and so on, around the ability to handle the volumes, and then with flights canceled, not enough pilots and air crew available, and aircraft orders falling behind, all that certainly created issues up and down the chain as well. And I think one of the areas that we started to focus on within our work this year was really a renewed focus, or a new focus on ESG, and certainly with the carbon footprint that our industry produces, especially obviously with the aircraft. This is an area that we're going to focus more and more on, and in fact our actual Farnborough discussions this year really related to climate change and the impact on the industry. And in fact, next year's report, we're going to really pivot toward the issues arising from ESG and climate change, greater focus on what's coming down the pipe in terms of electrification, sustainable aviation fuels, hydrogen-powered fuel cells. What does that mean for all of us in terms of our ability to get to, a net zero objective? As an aside, I was fortunate to attend the Hanover Messe show in Germany in May, I think it was, and I was pleasantly surprised when it came to the number of companies around the world, including quite a number of Canadian companies, and including in those quite a number of small and medium enterprise that were in the show hall, which was particularly focused on hydrogen. And so that was encouraging to see, and clearly with those type of issues, the public-private partnerships with government, with academia, as well as with industry, I think is particularly important if we're going to meet those objectives. So the final point on this slide is really, what are we seeing in deal size? And there's various charts in the paper, but I think deal volumes, and deal size are really changing, and I think one of the issues there is valuations. You know, the available deals are somewhat scarce. I'll talk more about this on the next slide, but the and because of that, you know, the pressure on valuations is not unusual in now to see if we just look at a metric of you know, EBITDA, if you will, you know, greater than 10 times is sometimes occurring now. Back a few years ago, we'd be, you know, happy to see that sort of, you know, 8 to 10 range of a multiple. Now, you know, we're seeing higher than that in certain areas, and we'll come back to that. So, you know, shortage of deals, pressure on valuations. Not everybody wants to spend that kind of money on acquisition. Then, of course, you know, the microeconomic factors around interest rates and, you know, cost of debt financing obviously is increasing around the world, and that's a concern as well. However, you know, as we pointed out in 2021, and I still think it's true to a large degree in 2022, there is, you know, a lot of cash still sitting on balance sheets, and so cash and equity financing are probably, you know, still more prevalent than debt anyway. Okay, so with that, I just want to watch my time here because I don't want to leave time for Q&A. I was asked to discuss, you know, some of the implications for the small and medium enterprises, although I would say many of these issues really do impact on the OEMs as well. And this is really where we got into a number of the discussions with industry leaders around the world that were focused on M&A, focused on corporate development. I only put one quote in the box on the right there that one of the executives, L3 Harris in the US, provided to us when we were interviewing him. And I'll just read it out because I think it's really telling, and it kind of sets the stage for the rest of this this slide. So he said, you know, we're seeing more tech companies with promising technological capabilities, especially among startups. And I use that because, you know, we are seeing various, you know, the larger companies looking at the smaller companies and saying, look, if we want to fill in a technological hole in our lineup, whatever that looks like, you know, smaller, maybe perhaps a greater number of deals, but speed to closing them, working with nimble companies, you know, all of that's very important. We'll talk more about that in a moment. The other issue that they all raised, and you'll see a quote, for example, from BAE Systems in the UK on this in the paper, but I found it, and we asked specifically about it, but they jumped on it very quickly when asked, and that's about retention of culture. You know, and I think particularly for SMEs that might be on this call and might be looking to do, you know, some form of partnering or transaction with someone up the supply chain, if you will. That's a real and live concern, I think, in terms of the culture of the company. You know, clearly, and we all know it from working in larger and more bureaucratic organizations, as I do as well, that we're not always that fast, we're not always that nimble. We take our time and make, you know, rational and reasoned and decisions and so on. But the smaller companies, you know, these enterprise level and tech, you know, startups and so on, often why they form in the first place is because they can be more nimble, flexible, agile, don't have the same sort of bureaucracy overhanging them. So what I found interesting and encouraging was the fact that the larger companies we spoke with, you know, were really quite apparently aware of that, and also, you know, took it into account in terms of how they were integrating acquisitions that they were doing. And I think that was particularly important because we've all seen, you know, failed deals. A deal went through, a lot of money was paid, but then, you know, the synergies that companies are looking for weren't necessarily achieved or recognized because it was absorbed too quickly into the mainstream of the larger entity. So I just wanted to mention that because I think it was particularly important and very consistent across the interviews that we did with you know, senior executives in the industry. So a number of other implications, starting at the top, the whole supply chain, and certainly with combination of pandemic and war and everything else, the focus on nearshoring, so bringing things closer to home, and I think that's important for Canadian SMEs. We all know where we stand in the global aerospace market, a very small domestic market. We really need to be exporting, and obviously the U.S. is our biggest source of exports for Canada in the sector. Not to denigrate any other countries around the world to which we export, but certainly the U.S. is right next door. So the focus on that, and the ability to kind of bring into the fold tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, I think is an important point to note. But one I'd really like to focus on today is this alternate forms of business combination. Again, in speaking with the executive teams that we interviewed for our paper this year, we all think of M&A as simply, I'm going to buy 100% of your company, I'm going to roll it in, maybe it stays a subsidiary, maybe it disappears. If we're going to integrate it well and retain the culture, we might kind of keep it a little bit apart. And that certainly historically was the case. But I think today, and certainly consistent message was any form of I'll call it inorganic growth is on the table today, and I think that's encouraging too, because it may just start with you're going to be in someone's supply chain, and that's great. You're providing a piece or a part or a service to help whatever it is they're producing or offering. So that's not a bad way to start. But seeing and hearing from the executives who said, look, we're interested in smaller equity stakes. We don't need to own 100%, but we want to have some seat at the board table so we can direct as to how it might fit in our own operation. So let's move from supplier to equity. For some companies that don't want to have equity owned by others, they were also open very much to partnerships, ventures, and alliances. So I think that's really important as well, because it's like dancing together before you get married. You don't necessarily want to jump in right away, with a full equity ownership on either side. So let's look at how we can operate under some form of a JV agreement, and I think that's particularly beneficial as well. I added here, although we really didn't discuss it in the paper, but certainly from a Canadian context, I think, especially on the defense side, obviously, where we have offset requirements and the ITBs and the rest, and you certainly look at ISED's website to see let's call it the ledger in the sky, because offset requirements are not booked on corporate ledgers, but they are certainly being maintained by ISED. And so we're certainly from Canadian context, we're seeing where I'll say the U.S. primes are operating in Canada have an offset requirement. I won't name names here, but I can think of quite a number of cases where cash investments and other forms of cooperation, alliances, and so on are being made with with Canadian companies, smaller Canadian companies that help the larger primes offset requirements. So I think from a Canadian context, that's particularly important as well. So as I mentioned earlier, on the tech side, the tech-focused transactions are really quite important, and I think this maybe it's obvious in terms of the OEMs and tier ones do have obviously doing a lot of R&D and innovation, and that's important, but they can't, and they admit that they don't necessarily have all the answers or seeing all the new technologies coming forward. So it makes sense to look for those opportunities to really, as I say here, fill the gaps by looking in particular at tech-based transactions. So we're certainly seeing more of that, and as I noted in the second bullet, it does help then build some of the technological capabilities and supply chain strengthening that the larger companies are looking for. Now, I wanted to spend a moment too on financial investors. We're on this call, we're probably primarily made up of strategic investors, i.e. those who are actually in the industry. But we've spent a bit of time looking at other forms of investment, and there's one of the papers on our website that we prepared last year, which was purely a private equity paper, and what's happening in that sector globally, as well spending time on the SPACs, the special purpose acquisition corporations, really out of favor today for the most part, but quite a number of deals, particularly in the US, had been done with SPACs over the past few years, and particularly in the space sector, there were quite a number. So that was important. But for this purpose, and we mentioned a little bit in this paper, more in other papers that we've done, but it's interesting to see more of the private equity players now, coming into aerospace, because I can think over the course of my career, you could have counted them on one hand, or maybe even a couple of fingers on one hand, versus needing all fingers and toes to count for all the strategic deals that we would have worked on. So it's interesting, and you think of Canada, and certainly the large one that comes to mind would be the Northern Private Capital deal, taking MDA out of Maxar a couple of years ago, which then they quickly turned around and did the IPO within a year for MDA in the space sector. But around the world, you think of the huge deal Advent in the US did with Cobham in the UK, and then obviously it had a big impact on the industry because they were rationalizing parts of those operations, and still are. Or interestingly, in the pandemic, we saw a lot more activity. I'll give the French example of a TKO ACE, and very interesting group. Some of the companies on this call may in fact be part of that consortium in France, and we do a sidebar case study on that in the paper. And that's an interesting read in terms of not just being a private equity house, but then very specifically focusing on aerospace within that. So a couple of comments around that. Much more focus on those type of things happening generally in Canada and rest of world, which I think can have an impact certainly on valuation and deal cost, if you will, because more you got your strategics, you got your financial houses like that, and then specific ones looking within aerospace. So I'll say more competition. Good for the seller, greater cost for the buyer though. So I think that's an interesting change that we're seeing. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the environmental objectives is really important. I think we all need to play a part in that with respect to what aerospace does, particularly at the airline level. But those of us that are supplying to it need to be focused on. The investors are calling for it. It's really a shout out from around the world to ensure that we're all doing our part. And and I would urge the smaller companies to be thinking about, if they don't have their own, ESG policy, board level discussion on what you're doing, I think that's an important element if you are looking for a potential transaction in the future, that the buyers will be saying, what have you done there? And not to make this a commercial for us at all, but I think we're spending around the world $1.5 billion on our ESG offerings because it's coming up more and more in deals, and so we're looking at diligence around ESG when we're doing deal due diligence for our clients. So I think it's affecting all of us. So I know I'm close to time because we want to leave enough time for Q&A. So I'll just close with two things on this, or a couple things on this page, and then just to show you where the links are to the various papers. But our conclusion from our work this year, really encompassed the three words that I put at the bottom here: resilience, agility, and flexibility. I won't go into detailed discussion on those to save time. I think we've, described them and using the various examples on the presentation so far. But keeping those in mind in terms of, how you're operating in your own business, or how you're working, by getting assistance from the academic sector, or, important government oversight and assistance as well. I think those are buzzwords that we're going to see more and more of. So what I'll finalize with is just this slide that really shows the links to the current report. I mentioned the 2021 report as well. So and you'll have these slides, or can go to the web to find them if you want to do more of a detailed read. And then we also issued in you see 2022-08, just after Farnborough, we issued a specific Canadian report as well. Probably won't show on screen very well. Much more about the numbers and deal flow in Canada as well, in terms of some examples. So just a smaller 2 or 3 or 4 page summary of what's happening that we try to put out around quarterly within Canada. We can certainly add people to that list as well. So Phil, I'm going to stop it there because I don't. Hopefully, some questions, comments, and discussion can ensure, and I can stop presenting at this point.
Great, thanks, Grant. As always informative, and always appreciate your insights. And yeah, I'll use this quick moment to remind everyone, please use the Q&A function to ask your questions. We have Grant for the next number of minutes, so we'd love to glean his expertise on any of these topics. And maybe, I know a few are going to start coming in. I might just start real quick with something that's been in my mind, Grant, and looking at some of the comments you made about these changing dynamics, some of these ideas of new ideas of partnerships, joint ventures, partnerships, some of the environmental pressures, push to the SMEs on their technological capabilities. Just wondering if you could speak to kind of the role of academics in helping the SMEs meet some of these push down challenges, or working with the OEMs or tier ones directly. How can they kind of support the ecosystem in advancing for the aerospace industry here in Ontario and across Canada?
That's a really good question. That's a really good question, Phil. And I can think back, a couple of years ago or a few years ago now, where we were helping clients with certain bids, and in particular within the defense side, but on aerospace platforms and so on, with the industrial technological benefits, the ITBs, and seeing very clearly there where you want to include the whole ecosystem. And I think academia falls nicely into that. What's happening at Centennial and other post-secondary institutions is really important. I would say it's underutilized too, because I don't think people necessarily think as a first point to say, let's go to academia and see how they can help. But boy, is it ever successful when you do that, because the advantages to me that academia can bring is severalfold. First, they're usually looking for interesting projects to work on. It's great for the students, whether it's post-grad or postdoc or whatever level you're working with. They just love to have something that's live and real and applied. So I think the fact that you can get probably essentially low cost or free assistance from academia, because they're anxious to have projects that they can sink their teeth into, I think is particularly important. But secondly, from an academic point of view, there's so much knowledge, innovation, intelligent people that are working in that sector. I think you're just leveraging up what you might have in your own environment, and particularly in a small company environment. Yeah, you're trying to do R&D, you're trying to be innovative, lots of other pressures though, and to have that, sort of partnership, with academia, and frankly at any size of company, you're just adding an element. I'll say the kind of the you want 3 legs of a stool, really. You're in industry, yes, but you want as much government support as you can get, and certainly you see the industry associations in Canada pushing for support, not just financial but other forms of support. So the government piece, but then the academic piece is that 3rd leg of the stool that I think, if you're not using it, you're doing yourself and your customers and your employees a disservice. So I think it's a really important part of the ecosystem.
Great, thanks. And I'm going to turn to a question from Colin McNeil, who's looking at the rapidly rising interest rate environment. Really an opportune time for those bigger cashed up companies looking at tuck-in acquisitions of smaller companies who might have high debt loads. So he's just wondering if you can provide your views on how those rising interest rates can impact deal flow and M&A activity over the coming years, really over the next half decade.
Yeah, no, it's a real concern, and we saw the Bank of Canada's latest round of increases last week. I think it was 0.75%, again 75 basis points. And we're going to see it in the UK. I think once we're post the Elizabeth funeral next week, they're going to do theirs, and I think we're looking for a similar increase. So it's really a global phenomenon, and certainly some countries are doing it faster and higher than even Canada or the US. So it is a concern. I think it's an interesting sector because certainly a lot of the larger companies were amassing war chests over the pandemic. They were supporting their lower tier supply chains, with cash or other incentives in terms of payment terms and things. So at the most significant level or the highest level of global OEMs, I think there's still lots of cash. But when you start coming down the chain, and particularly if we start at sort of the bottom of the chain, those startups, those enterprise, private enterprise type entities that are getting maybe some angel money, some family money, some bootstrapping, whatever, maybe conventional financing in some ways. There are some mezzanine houses out there that really charge fortune for their money, and they to the extent you can get that sort of optimal mix of financing, and so that would include all sources, as much equity financing as one can get, but certainly many of the traditional sources of financing aren't necessarily going to want to provide equity, and they do want that debt. It's an issue for sure, because and I think, I don't know, can I say we've become a little bit complacent over the years because we had so many years of such low interest rate environment that us older folks do remember the 80s and other years where it was in that double digit zone. So and I think what it can do, if the debt load becomes so significant, and the cost of servicing that so significant, it's cutting into funds that you can otherwise spend, on R&D or marketing or operations generally. So it's going to become a bigger part of the profit and loss statement, which I think is a concern. What that might lead to, of course, and certain elements of the pandemic probably did this too, but now we have, high inflation environment, a high interest rate environment, pressure on salaries because we can't get the staff that we want, so we're going to have to pay more. It may lead to financial distress. And I can tell you, and met with some at Farnborough, there were a number of, I'll call them private equity houses though, but focused specifically on, on distressed companies. But it's not where you want to be, so really, I think what people need to do is be keeping a very close eye on their balance sheet with respect to the debt, and their P&L with respect to rising costs of all types, including interest, and kind of get ahead of it. If things are happening, you've got a great technology, but you're not going to be able to get it to market or get the kind of sales you want on it. I will say that the people we interviewed are doing deal scan and deal flow all the time. So you don't want to wait until you're in that most distressed mode and you're not going to like the deal. Get out ahead of it. It may be hard to swallow and to admit, but get out ahead of it and see if you can, start looking at some of those, partnerships, equity injections, full M&A sale if that's what you want. But I think it has to be front and center now with companies with higher debt loads. Phil.
Great. Thanks, Grant. And kind of dovetailing off that from a question from Mark Maybank, looking at the idea of transaction multiples, and then kind of what you're seeing in the, a little bit on the defense versus the commercial business, kind of in these dynamics.
Yeah, and that's a really good question too, because and certainly we do in our analysis try to bifurcate between what we see on the defense side and what we see on the civil side, if you will, as it relates to aviation, and it could be quite jarring, really quite different at this point in time. I mean, they can converge because obviously different. If you look at different parts of the supply chain, you may be producing a part that actually can, fit an aircraft, and whether that aircraft is used in defense or used in civil, and I can think of some companies we've worked with certain pieces of kit that really just are tying into the engine or tying into the landing gear or whatever it's tying into. But so it doesn't really matter in those cases so much. But if that balance is off, and I do see a lot of companies where they're either all defense or all civil, and and they're looking to kind of, I'll say, get away from the economic dependence on one versus the other, and really try to balance that out in terms of working with both sectors. So I think that part could be important, because everything's a cycle, right? So whether you're dealing in business jets and that cycle of economics, or the passenger jets and what's happened with the pandemic and beyond, or purely the defense platforms, and rising and falling defense budgets, like it's hard to pull on all the right levers at all the right times. So it's interesting, because in the multiples, and you'll see in the Canadian piece in particular, where we've got a whole chart of multiples on one page, and they're all publicly available multiples from the various investment houses. But it's interesting to look at, because certainly the defense companies were trading at much higher multiples. The civil side was down, and I think where the market gets confused is those that really are kind of working with both, and so over the course of a number of years, and probably including some members of this call, there were carve-outs that were being done, because either divestment of non-core assets or spin-offs of assets into separate public companies, because if you're trying to maximize your multiple, the market really wants clarity around what business are you really in, and spinning it off into a separate entity can really identify that. So but I think as a general comment in response to the question, and what we're seeing today is this this push generally on multiples, because I think if you have a deal in hand, and if it's in a sector, whether it's technology focused, which it may be, defense versus civil may be, but I think what you're seeing is if there's a deal flow happening, and I can think of a deal where there were 12 bidders, and one ultimately got it, but my goodness, they really had to pay for it, but they were so anxious to have it to tuck into their chain that they went for it, and many others, obviously the other 11 or whatever it was, dropped off. So bidding wars can ensue, and I think depending on if you're on the seller side, of course you want the highest multiple you can. If you're on the buyer side, which many on this call might be as well, it's really creating those relationships and saying, okay, you're in our supply chain now, maybe we're going to give you an offset advance of some kind, can we partner on this or that project or program, and building up to a point where maybe then you're pulling the trigger on the full M&A, but because of that relationship you built, not really going to market and making it as competitive, because they want to work with you, want to be sold to you, and you can save a bit then on the multiple pressure. But if you're just going out and scanning the market and looking for what to buy, people sort of drop like flies pretty quickly, because they say, I don't want to pay 10 and 12 times EBITDA for something. So it all depends on how anxious and, I'll say, desperate you might be.
Thanks for that. And we've got about 10 more minutes that I want to get through kind of a few additional questions here, and have one from Susan. Quite interesting, looking at the idea of US and Canada partnerships. What are some of those opportunities for maybe US SMEs to partner with Canadian companies, and I would say vice versa, if you could speak to that.
That's interesting, and I could think of a couple of examples where there's a little bit of testing the waters, if you will, particularly on the space side. We haven't talked too much about space today, but we're really seeing that as a with everything that's happening now in I'll say both the government sector, but also the private sector, with the big launches and capability and so on. I can think of an example in that sector, for example, where You know, the US has a bit more experience in say launch capability than Canadian does, and want to work together, you know, on something. I think that's one example that I can think of right off the bat where we're seeing that. Of course, with the US, if there's any element of the you know, defense to it and the ITAR type restrictions that you know, that they're so well known for, and can be, you know, a deal challenge, if you will. And yet I have seen examples of kind of working around ITAR as well, particularly in using, you know, Canadian companies to have the right capability that doesn't kind of go into that realm. So I think I'd say it's a great idea. I haven't seen a lot of it yet. I use that one space example where people are trying to work together across border. And I think, you know, really the kind of the early discussion on how is this going to work, you know, and anytime you put a border in the middle of a transaction or a partnership or alliance, you know, it raises a number of other issues, legal issues, tax issues, regulatory issues like ITAR and so on. So I'd say it's a great idea. It'd be a very, you know, agile thing to do but just use your advisors carefully to ensure it can be done in a way that isn't going to kind of create a nightmare or show later. But I really like the thought, and I haven't given it enough thought, so I'm going to do that. So thanks, Susan, for that question.
Great, thanks, Grant. And you just kind of mentioned, you know, regulatory, and that you know, dovetails into maybe another question I can pose to you around, you know, we've talked kind of the larger players in the industry, the smaller players. We've kind of touched on academia, but maybe you could speak a little bit to the role of government, whether it be kind of a subnational or national, you know, when it comes to some of these dynamics and supporting the industry, you know, obviously regulatory or different policies, trade, financially, facilitation of connections. So kind of love to get your sense of government's role across the ecosystem here.
Yeah, and by way of background, I led our government practice at the federal level in Ottawa for 5 or 10 years, and you know, when I look at government, and you know, and I would put the fourth leg in there as sort of the industry association, you know, or collaborative groups like yourself and OAC and AIAC as well into this mix too, because I think we all have a part to play. But when it comes to government itself, you know, and I look at, you know, some of the global shows that we like to attend, whether it's Farnborough, Paris, or other global shows, Hanover Messe, like the government, you know, contribution and support, you know, with, you know, whether it's you know, people like Mr. Champagne at the federal level, you know, we had provincial leaders there, certainly at Farnborough this time. You know, they bring the local trade commissioners to the table. Like they're so willing to work with all of us, you know, and we often think of it just from sort of a cash or, you know, financing or, you know, various incentive programs, you know, perspective, and that's fine. Those are there, and we'll all take advantage of those. They're intended to incentivize an industry to do better, to grow, to export, and so on. So all of those government and crown bodies at either level really help. But I think, you know, there's more to it than that. The relationships that they have with their counterparts, you know, either around the country, around the world, is so important. Like it's again, it's like leverage. You know, if you're not taking advantage of it, you should be. And whether, you know, it's within some of the, you know, 3-letter bodies in Ottawa, you know, like BDC and CCC and EDC and so on, you know, that's one level. But, you know, you mentioned the provincial level, and, you know, having, you know, the support of the industry minister and others, like, and actually, you know, just because Farnborough was only a couple of months ago, and seeing how the provincial people and federal people were working so closely together, on stage together, speaking together, going to meetings together, you know, and their support for this, for, you know, this sector and the advocacy that they try to bring and accept from the industry associations as well. Like, it's really, you know, and you know, and obviously DAIR fits right into that mix with Maurice and the team. You know, Canada is small. Canada is a small domestic market. You know, we punch above our weight. You know, the reports always say Canada's sort of fifth on the world stage when it comes to aerospace. And between, Ontario, Quebec, and other parts of the country, we're really focused, on the sector. But we've got to work together because, if you look at our neighbor to the south, or you look at what's happening in, UK, other parts of Europe, and so on, if we don't work together, we're sunk. And and I would even extend that to, yes, we're competitive in industry, and industry entities often look at each other, but they have to be collaborative as well. And I've seen more and more examples where that's happening, particularly with, say, the ESG and how we can work together on, new engines, new fuels, whatever it might be. So I think, and I raise that only to say that the whole ecosystem of aerospace has to work together, and, government's an absolutely important partner in that.
Great. And I know we're just kind of coming to the end. You can still get your last question in, but maybe I'll pose this one to you to maybe kind of sum up a little bit when we're talking, especially around the SMEs. And you've talked about a lot of different opportunities, whether they be kind of on the research and technological partnerships, joint ventures, could be equity stakes. Maybe from your perspective, what should be front of mind to those SMEs, to those companies when they approach conversations, when they're looking at discussing with partnerships? What should be maybe the 2 or 3 kind of main things that they kind of are thinking about when they're approaching those types of partnership or JV conversations with other players? Yeah,
and I think probably the most important is to really have a self-awareness around what your own objective is. They may be approaching you, or you may be approaching them, or maybe a mutual thing as you're running into each other at a trade show or other opportunity. But because I think at an SME level, the fact we're talking about private corporations. We're talking about people, who've probably gotten out of large organizations at one point. Maybe they had a, background there, but said, "Hey, I've got an idea and I want to follow it through, on my own speed and track." So what is it you're looking for? So the objective to me would be number 1. Number 2 would be, really having an organized approach, whether it's a business case, whether it's an information memorandum, because when you're in a meeting with a larger entity, you've got to be organized. You got to know your stuff, and I think a lot of the SMEs have the greatest sort of technology ideas, but have they surrounded themselves with good financial people, good marketing people, and the rest of the, operational skill sets that one needs. And maybe that's what your objective is. Maybe you're looking for that part. You don't have the, distribution channels or contacts that might expand on the sales side, or whatever it might be. Or maybe you are running out of cash and, need an injection. But to be, organized, honest, having, it's kind of like a Dragon's Den approach, I guess, in some ways, Phil, where, you're really looking to come in and be credible, I think is important. So, having, help from, your legal advisor, your accounting advisors, your financial advisors, whatever it might be, would be important in showing that, hey, yeah, I might be small today. I'm growing. I think I'm going to be in a position to be on, a more serious domestic and world stage. I've got a technology that's great, but I, could really use this or that from you to get there. So I think those are the points that I would raise. So credibility, organized, business case or plan, and understanding your own objectives, because you don't really want to lose control of what you have, perhaps, and being very clear on that on the way in.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and I'm cognizant that we've just got a couple of minutes left, and so that might be our last question as we kind of come to a close. I wanted to remind everyone that we're going to share the links to the reports that Grant has been sharing from and put on his slide. So we'll share the slides and those reports with all of the attendees. And of course, if there's follow-up questions, coming through DAIR and to Grant, we're happy to engage. But I think this is a really kind of an important topic and impacting the entire ecosystem, as Grant's kind of been touching on, and a lot of topics that we could probably spend days unpacking. So I know there'll be follow-up discussions from this. So I do want to maybe make mention of a couple of things just as we wrap here. Grant, you were talking, of course, around the technological capability of SMEs and strengthening supply chains, which nicely aligns with some of the activity that DAIR is doing through our supplier development initiative, and then looking on the sustainability side, and that's kind of aligning with our green fund. So two initiatives that we're hoping to help in a small way support the SMEs to compete globally and contribute to these dynamics. So Grant, I want to thank you. This has been very informative. We appreciate your insights. We know that we'll be bringing you back, I'm sure, as we move forward to have continued and more deep conversations on some of these topics. But I want to thank everyone. Again, encourage you to check out the dairhub.com website on some of our upcoming events, and we will be sharing all of the material from today with the participants. So I'll thank everyone again and wish everyone a great rest of the day. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today, and thank you, Grant.
Well, you're welcome, and thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Good day to everyone. Take care.
Thank you.